Heart-Shaped Box is a horror novel. My third novel, NOS4A2, Nosferatu, is a horror novel. That's a book about a guy who has a car that runs on human souls instead of gasoline. So those are both pretty scary books. Horns is my second book, is not really a horror novel. It's kind of more of a tragic satire, although it does have elements of the supernatural in it. It was actually made into a film starring Daniel Radcliffe, so that it has sort of a cult status among my books. And then the more recent novel, The Fireman, is kind of a big action-filled sci-fi movie that happens to be on paper.
That's quite an incredible range. I mean, if somebody was looking to get into Joe Hill, what would be the very first book you'd recommend them starting with, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because it really depends on what people like. It depends on the person. If someone wants a really, pedal to the floor, roller coaster type experience, they'd probably want either my first or my third, because those are the two sort of most straight ahead. Here's a thriller. A lot of people have really enjoyed the comic book. I've had, I think that the readership of my novels grew substantially after I started writing my comic book, Locke Key. So, yeah, I mean, it really depends on the reader.
I think the short stories are a great place to dip in as well, because they're very varied, aren't they? Again, as you just said, some are horror, some are kind of science fiction. There's it's like a great. Did you start out in short stories, Joe? Is that where you started?
So I sort of had my own bestseller experiment that I started in about, I want to say 1994. So, this is not like top secret news or anything. It's been out there for over a decade. I come from a family of writers. My dad's the novelist Stephen King. And I always wanted to be a writer.
Never heard of him.
Yeah, Stephen who?
He's a guy who shows tremendous promise. He's written a couple books. They've done pretty well, and
I've heard of Tabitha King and I've heard of Owen King. I don't know who this pretender is.
I come from this whole family of amazing writers, My mother's an amazing writer. My brother is. About the time I was 13, 14, I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I started writing every day. And I've written every day of my life since I was about 14. I think I've probably produced about 35 pages a week since I got to high school. When I was 18 or 19, I began to think, I come from this famous family, and I have this famous last name, and it occurred to me that might be a disadvantage, not a benefit to me. Because I felt like there was too much potential that I would write a mediocre novel, and that a publisher would see a chance to make a quick buck in the last name, and would publish a book that wasn't very good. And you can fool readers once, but you can't fool them twice. And my feeling was that if this mediocre novel was published and readers looked at it, they'd say, rightly, he only got published because he has a famous dad. I'm never going to waste my time with him again. And I wanted to have I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. And I wanted to have the longest, best possible career. And I felt like the only way to do that was to provide people with stories that really, truly excited them, where it didn't matter who my parents were. It didn't matter what my history was. All that mattered was they were into what was happening and they wanted to know what would happen next. So I abandoned my last name and I started writing as Joe Hill. And over 10 years, I wrote 4 novels that I was never able to sell, and dozens of short stories that I wasn't able to sell. And I collected my the mandatory 1,000 rejection letters. And actually, the joke is that after writing 4 novels, I actually began to think probably I didn't have the talent or ability to be a novelist, that I had taken my swing and struck out and, lost my shot. But I had written some short stories that had appeared in little literary magazines, and some of them had won some prizes or got prize buzz. And one of these short stories was noticed by a talent scout at Marvel Comics, who invited me to write a Spider-Man story. Wow. And I remember feeling like I really wanted to be a novelist. This was my life stream. It didn't work out. It's not happening. But I've got a foot in the door over in the comic book business. And if I wind up writing Ghost Rider and, The Flash, that could be a pretty great life. I still get to tell stories and play make-believe for a living, and that would be terrific. So I started writing in comics. I was really a comic book writer before I was a novelist. Around the same time, I had 15 pretty good short stories. I couldn't sell them to any publisher in America. I couldn't sell them to any of the big publishers in England. A very small press in England, PS Publishing, took a chance on the book of stories because the editor there was himself a short story writer in the genre of the fantastic and horror fiction. And they did 1,000 copies, and it won some awards and got some buzz. I was able to sell a novel shortly afterwards. And then eventually it came out about my pen name. As soon as I started doing public appearances, people started to look at me and say, boy, doesn't he kind of look like, and so, but it didn't really matter. At that point, it didn't really matter because I had what I needed for my self-confidence and my own, I needed to believe that I could do it, that I didn't need to lean on a family name, that people would enjoy my fiction for what it was, as opposed to, thinking, oh, this is cool because his dad is someone famous and
that's brilliant.
That's not much fun.
It's such an inspiring story. And it must have been, it would have been so easy to go down that route of trying to use your dad's name as a way of starting your career. And massive props to you for, 10 years. There must have been times during that. What were some of the points where you just thought, it's never going to happen?
Well, I remember I had sent several stories to C. Michael Curtis, the senior fiction editor at the Atlantic Monthly. And he had written me back personal notes. He never published anything, but he had written back some stuff. I remember I sent them a story that I thought was pretty good. And this is the old days. This was like almost pre-internet. And so I would send out a physical story, not a digital manuscript. And when they sent it back, I would physically get back my manuscript so I could use it again. I would include a self-stamped return mailer. Wow, and they would send it back in that. So I would always get my story back. And I sent one of my best stories to the Atlantic, and I got back an envelope instead of my mailer with my short story in it. And it was just the right size to contain a check. And I thought, holy shit, I've done it. I just got published by the Atlantic Monthly. And I was married at the time, and this was like, again, pre-cell phones. I didn't own a cell phone. No one did. And I went outside to the payphone, and I called the woman I was married to, I called my wife, and I said, oh my God, I think the Atlantic Monthly published me. I'm holding an envelope. And she said, oh my God, that's the best. You've got to tear it open and read it to me. And I said, oh, this is the best. This is the best. And she said, I'm so proud. I said, I just don't believe it. And I tore it open, and it was a photocopied foreign rejection. And scribbled at the bottom was a note that said, sorry, we lost your story.
Oh, no. Oh, unbelievable.
And that was it. And I remember that was such a tremendous kick in the nuts that I remember thinking, I'm pretty much done. It's never happening. The other thing I did spend 3 years writing this giant epic fantasy novel called The Fear Tree. And I thought I hit it out of the park. I thought this thing was a smash. And it got turned down by every publisher in America, and it got turned down by every publisher in England, and for an extra kick in the pants, it got turned down by every publisher in Canada. And my dad had read the book, and he loved the book, and he was always very supportive of the pen name. But I remember him saying when that got turned down, maybe the deck was stacked too much. And I knew what he was saying, and I said, Dad, I think I would rather fail with the pen name than succeed, knowing that I broke in using the family. And he said, okay. And dropped the subject, never brought it up again. So, and after The Fear Tree, it was still, I think, probably another 3 or 4 years before I finally did sell 20th Century Ghosts in heart-shaped box.
I think it's amazing as well, because we often talk to authors about the high points of their career, the moment where they held that first book in their hand. But with such an incredible army of writers out there, it's good to hear that, the low points as well, because the fact you came back from that, what was the thing that kept you going, though, at that point where you could have probably just smashed that public phone box?
What kept me going? I think I was absolutely unfit to do anything else. And I also think at that point, at a certain point, I realized I had written, I say I had written 4 novels, but actually going back to when I was 14, I probably wrote 12. Because I wrote my first book when I was 14 years old. I wrote this thing about a private high school where the administration was a gang of satanic devil worshippers, and that the cafeteria was serving the beef stroganoff was actually human bodies. That was a book called Midnight Eats, and I wrote that when I was 14. So I probably wrote something like 12 novels between the time I was 14 and the time when I finally got published, which was 35. And I think at about the age of 28, 29, I thought, there's no way I'm quitting because I put way too much time into this. You know, after this long, it's no longer acceptable to screw it up. Although, like I say, that's one side. There was the bravado side, which is like, I'd never quit. You know, I'm going to die doing this.
If you hadn't been published, would you still be writing now? Would you be self-publishing, do you think?
I don't know if I ever would have gone for self-publishing, because for me, personally, I needed the validation of an editor. You know, that I think self-publishing would have seemed like cheating to me. You know, that somehow that's not doing it right. That's not how you're supposed to do it. So I think I needed someone to say, yes, you're good enough, that I could never have been the kind of person who could say to himself, you're good enough, that this is good enough. I needed some sort of outer validation.
I guess you're the only person in the world that when your dad says you're good enough, you have to go, yeah, but you would say that, you're my dad. Yeah,
well, I'm sure that's what everyone's, right? Isn't that, don't your parents always say, you're a genius?
Well, absolutely. So it must have been doubly hard for you because, you know, you have to hear it externally. I mean, that's actually been a theme we've heard from. It's that moment of belief that is almost the spark for every successful writer's journey, where they truly, it might be an inner belief, but it's also sometimes that external validation. Who was it that gave you that validation, would you say? Can you remember pinpointing the moment where you thought this is going to happen?
There were three people, but I want to say something, Mark D. I want to go back to something you said in the very first podcast.